And if you do want to tweet while you're while listening to this presentation, please do so. And our fairly inactive account is CSWEF1. So SJ, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you very much. Okay, let's do the techie bit and see if I can get my presentation up. How's that look? All good? Brilliant.
That's perfect, yeah.
Super. Okay. So, hi, everybody. Thank you very much for having me along and coming along to hear me speak. As Phil said, I've got a background in the police. I was a police officer for 18 years. I come from a police family. Both of my parents are police officers. My husband's a police officer, so and now I'm researching the police. So I'm very much institutionalized. But the drive and motivation for my research actually comes out of my own personal experience of struggling with my own mental health as a police officer. I was a DI in Manchester Met, in Greater Manchester Police before I struggled with my mental health and realised that due to the stigma attached to mental health and emotions in the police service, I had a choice between my mental health and my career. And it's then that I took what was a very difficult decision to go back to academia and to look what I was going to do next. And what I did do next is to start researching the police. I did my master's in HR and then on to do my PhD. And my PhD looked at emotional labour in policing and the link to mental health outcomes, and particularly PTSD through dissociation, which is the main finding of my research. So my drive is, as you can see from the title, whose responsibility is resilience? Because too often and not, and this isn't unique to the police, the resilience is something that is seen as the individual's responsibility. But my argument is, particularly for the police service, that it's very difficult to be resilient in a culture that actually actively works against that. And I'm hoping to explain my perspective on that as we go through. So my theory is that I used to explore the culture of the police, the emotional culture of the police, is Emotional Labour by Ali Hochschild. Now, I'll go a little bit into this, but you have the encyclopedia of knowledge and expertise in emotional labour in Paul Brooks with you. So I'm going to make it brief. But emotional labour was coined in the 1980s by Ali Hochschild. And it's about this display of an emotion. So that can be physical, the way that you are perceived by other people, the effort that you put in to display an emotion. But on this occasion, it's sold for a wage. It is intrinsic, it is part of your job, your role, and it's required as part of your role. Now, emotional labour is an extension of emotion work, and this is how I find it the best way to explain this. So emotion work is something that we do in every day of our lives, and we use it to oil the relationships, our social relationships. And the best way I can explain it is if you can cast your mind back. Now, maybe not last Christmas, but the Christmas beforehand, because last Christmas was, let's say, a little different to the usual Christmas we have, but perhaps a couple of Christmases ago. And consider the scenario that you have a significant other and your significant other has invited you to attend their Christmas celebrations on Christmas Day at a relative's house. And this is a large gathering of all the family, distant aunts and uncles and cousins are all there with grandparents and parents. And this is a very important event for you. This significant other is important to you, and you're hoping that this relationship will be a long-lasting relationship. So you attend, the family do, and all is going well, and it's post-Christmas dinner, and everybody's sat in the most comfortable room in the house, the front room or wherever it be. The cousins are sat on the floors, the grandmas are sat, on the comfortable chairs, and it's present giving time. And everybody's taking turns to exchange gifts, and it is now your turn to receive gifts. And this particular moment, it is the duty of the oldest member of the family, an important member of the family, to present their gift to you. And you can see by the look on their face as they stand up and start to walk towards you across the room with this gift in their hand, that they believe that they have got you the perfect Christmas gift. And as they're walking across the room to you, you can feel the weight of everybody's eyes, all the cousins, all the grandmas, all the aunts and uncles, upon you as you receive this gift. And so you smile and you gratefully receive the gift and you begin to unwrap it. And as you unwrap this gift, you see what it is and you are thinking, oh my life, what on earth? Why on earth would they ever think that perhaps, what, oh my, no. But at the same time, you don't show any of this. What you display to everybody within that room is utter gratitude and joy at receiving this present. Although you know from that moment onwards, if you are lucky enough to stay in this family, that you will be receiving this and other similar presents for the entirety of your life. And so what you do and say is you say thank you. You are gracious. You show joy at receiving this present and you make sure that the giver understands that you are so grateful and flattered by their choice, despite at the same time in the back of the head regifting onto somebody else who may have more use of the said present. And this is emotion work. This is where we are hiding what we call our authentic and inner emotions and keeping them to ourselves and expressing something entirely different. And the reason to do this, well, in this occasion is because we're polite and we're kind and we don't want to offend people. But we do this in order to manipulate the emotions of the other people that we are in engagement with. In this case, the family and that significant family member. And this is emotion work. It has a use value to us. It's something we do every day of our lives. We learn it as young children to manipulate our parents. We know how to work this. But emotional labour is actually when we do this as part of our work role and we do it in exchange for a wage. And we do it and we understand this through feeling and display rules, which in an organisation, well, in a social context as well, are often implied rather than written down. Sometimes they're written down, certainly for the police, as a code of ethics about not displaying anger or deriding attitude towards others and colleagues. But often they're implied and learnt by watching the behaviours of others. And it's this theory that I used to explore the culture within the police service. So what is emotional labour for the police? Well, during the incident, I felt scared and I felt out of control and totally helpless with regards to not being able to help this person. A fear of being scared to, even if the opportunity arose. I'd say I probably held back from showing how I really felt at the scene. I didn't want anyone to see that I was panicked, obviously. So this is somebody that has turned up at a potential suicide attempt. And they're actually, what I know from the background of this person is they've got a history of somebody attempt suicides in their family, and they are actually feeling quite emotionally overwhelmed by this. But their job, as every police officer's job, is not to show their emotions, but actually to take control of the scene, deal with what's in front of them. And that is a police officer's job, and I am not arguing against that. Give me a second, my slides have just stopped. But it goes further than just when police officers are dealing with incidents on the street. So we have the feeling rules and the display rules of police officers. And these are these hidden, these often assumed rules that people pick up from the actions of others. So on this occasion, a police officer is speaking about having been to a child protection incident and coming back to the office and having to do the paperwork. And they say, I just think that there is a culture in the police where you're expected to be macho and tough and able to deal with anything that is put in front of you, and then be able to move on and do all the written work and be professional and stay late and get everything down, even though your head might be done in seeing something that's quite traumatic, whether it's for the first time or the 50th time. And there's a real expectation from supervisors that you'll just do it. And if you don't, or if you're emotional or over emotional, showing any kind of emotion, they see that as a sign of weakness. And as long as we feel that they see that as a sign of weakness, we will never show it. And there you go. You see they're articulated without knowing it, organisational expectations of emotional display and emotional experience. Now, I became interested in this because Arlie Hochschild argues for and identifies feeling and display rules from the organisation. But I actually take this further and look how those feeling and display rules go beyond the organisation, go beyond the organisational setting, beyond being on the street, beyond being in the locker room and the report writing room, but actually into police officers' homes and their social lives. These rules continue. We have this expectation of police officers that they just don't feel in the same way that we do. So what are the consequences of this? Well, Arlie Hochschild in her original study identified emotional dissonance and burnout. But I've looked one step further because I'm really interested in the clinical mental health outcomes, the emotional labour and the culture around emotions in the police, and the consequences of those. And I looked at the outcome of dissociative behaviour and how emotional suppression linked and actually emotional labour within the police requires police officers to behave dissociatively. So what is dissociative behaviour from a clinical perspective? So it's splitting off from awareness, thoughts, feelings or memories. It's that compartmentalising of an emotion that you're uncomfortable with. It's pushing something away when you don't want to deal with it or trying not to think about it. And this has already been identified in the police as a way of police officers trying to cope, an avoidant coping technique. So Aaron in 2000 conducted a piece of research and looked at dissociative behaviour through avoidant coping. He says that officers who employ such defences are more likely to become ill through to dissociating, avoiding their emotions and go on to have psychiatric difficulties, as opposed to those officers who actually engaged with their emotions, who took on the task of dealing with those challenging and uncomfortable thoughts and emotions and actually moving on to process them. They had better and healthier outcomes. So in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual 5 of 2013, the most recent edition, PTSD, dissociation is actually now moved into and is understood to be an integral element of PTSD. So it's about how suppressing your memories interferes with the encoding of those memories. So what this is, so when we go through trauma, our amygdala fires up, and when the amygdala fires up, it floods the brain with chemicals, all the adrenaline, we know all about the fight and flight. But what that's doing at that point is it is also overwhelming the campus, which is responsible for filing our memories. So this is where PTSD comes. We've got these intrusive thoughts, these intrusive memories, these intrusive feelings, because we haven't, the memories are not filed by the hippocampus. What happens is we continue to dissociate beyond the actual trauma, or we're already dissociating prior to the trauma. These memories don't have a chance to get coded. The hippocampus doesn't have a chance to do its job whilst the amygdala isn't firing and file those memories. And that's how we get PTSD flashbacks. What we do know is that early psychological and social support actually moderates the complexity and the debilitating nature of post-traumatic stress disorder. So in that, what we mean is, if there's somebody who's been through a traumatic incident and they're able to speak to somebody they trust in a place where they feel safe, and hence their amygdala is calmed down, and actually talk about and speak and sense make of their experience, their emotions with somebody who's either been in the same event or a similar event, then they are less likely to go on to get PTSD, because it makes sense, because they're feeling safe and they're verbalizing their emotional experiences, where the brain can start processing and making sense of the experience they've had, and the hippocampus can fight it, and they don't get those intrusive thoughts. So it's quite simple for me how we can actually deal with it from a clinical perspective, how we can reduce PTSD. It's allowing people to talk when they feel safe and providing them with that. But this is, as simple as it may be, it seems like a huge task to actually achieve this. It doesn't require lots of money throwing at it. It doesn't require lots of psychiatrists. It just requires a better culture and supportive culture within the police service. So then the DSM says that dissociation is a disruption of discontinuity in the normal integration of consciousness, memory, identity, emotion, perception, body representation, motor control and behaviour. And there are three different types of dissociation. There's at the time of the event, generalised, which is prior to the event, and persistent, which is post-event. And that's really important when you think about how police officers are dissociating, and as we'll go through and see, all of the time. Sorry, I've gone the wrong way. So we know that generalized dissociation is particularly damaging to those exposed to repeat trauma, like police officers, because they're constantly dissociative. So going into an event and coming out of an event, they're dissociating, and they're not processing those emotions. And if they're consistently dissociating, they're more likely to get PTSD. And here's some symptomology, and just have a think about and try and hang on to these words, because you'll see how they come up in my findings and how they are articulated by police officers. So first one, symptomology for dissociation. I know I have feelings, but I don't feel them. So emotional and physical numbing, a sense of lack of agency and able to change things, feeling robotic and presenting in a robotic demeanour. Now, my paper, which is actually from my master's dissertation, is actually called Robocop, because just that was the feeling of expectation on officers. And then hypo-emotionality with others. So this is not having an emotional response with or an emotional engagement with other people. And then hypo-reactivity to emotional stimuli, which is not responding with normal emotional reactions to an emotional stimulus, such as perhaps a dead body or something like that. So these are my findings. And what's important to me is that I use qualitative data. I used audio diary as my main data collection tool, because I feel the one thing is that emotional labour silences the experience, the lived experience of police officers, their lived emotional experience. And I believe it was really important to have these voices heard. Throwing statistics too often and not in the police is a way of depersonalising that police officer, which is something that we're already doing to them. So I needed for them, their experiences, not my experience, but their experiences, to be heard, so that people couldn't deny that this is what was happening within the police service. What I found as an outcome as well of that, as a nice aside from that, is that the actual process of using audio diaries, of recording their emotional experiences, gave police officers an opportunity, an outlet, and an ability to process emotions, and it had a therapeutic effect on them. So these are my findings of emotional labour in the police and dissociation contributing to PTSD. So my first was this discrepancy between rhetoric and reality. So police officers will tell you that the job has come on a long way, and that we now talk about mental health and well-being and our emotions. It was ironic, because when I actually, after the audio diaries, I interviewed some police officers, and they said, yeah, we're really good at this. And I said, okay, so can you tell me, who do you tell how you feel? Well, we don't talk about our feelings. So yeah, we talk about mental health, but we don't talk about actually how it is that we feel. And generally speaking, the officers feel that they're not supported by their senior leadership teams. They also believe that their well-being is secondary to the investigation and the public perception of the police, and that there are consequences, career-limiting consequences, to expressing emotions or mental health. And I'm not going to go through every quote, because, like I said, you can have the slides after, because there's quite a lot here. But the top quote is from an inspector who was diagnosed with PTSD. And they were saying, I'm very embarrassed about PTSD, very embarrassed, because it's a weakness, isn't it? Which speaks volumes about the attitude within the police service. And then the last quote here, it just shows how the culture, the emotional labour within the police service actually damages the service that police officers feel they can deliver to members of the public. So they say, when I'm out with other people being, colleagues, when they're double crewed, they say, I'm very guarded as how I might react to something. It is easy to just deal with it sort of cold, if you like, which is not the compassionate service that we ask our officers to deliver. Now, my data collection, I wasn't looking for the big job, as we would call it. I was looking for the constant daily business that is the complex PTSD, where there's many events, traumatic events that lead to complex PTSD, and the culture around them. But because my data collection year, I did actually record a number of terrorist acts, unfortunately. But it did give me into an insight, because I thought, well, we've got the big job first. We look after people after that. But certainly we didn't. And this is the sergeant here speaking of the team that were first on scene to a large-scale terrorist attack. And they felt that just coming back into work the next day, nobody spoke about what happened. Nobody referenced that they dealt with a terrorist act, that there had been a terrorist act. And what that did was actually silence them. They were just expected to carry on as if nothing happened. And, part of dissociation is derealization. And there was this kind of like surreal feeling about, hang on a minute, this thing happened, but It was not acknowledged by the senior leadership team, and this made them feel quite weird and quite unwell. Not surprisingly, I found the role of the supervisor was key in people's behaviours and their coping. I had both good and bad stories. It was definite that if officers young in a service had a good supervisor that actually would take them aside and identify that had been through a significantly traumatic incident and told them that it was okay to express their emotions, that they were more likely to go on throughout their career, be healthier and feel more comfortable about talking about their emotions. But by the same token, there were many poor supervisors that were obviously quite dissociated, unwell, burnt out themselves, that actually weren't able to do that and just depersonalised the officers and saw them as resources to get the job done rather than the holistic human being. So back to that DI that was embarrassed about PTSD. Well, she had a really bad time, and she actually phoned up her chief inspector. She was in work and phoned up the chief inspector and said, "I'm not feeling well." She said, "I can't feel my face. I haven't slept all night. I feel like someone's put a rope around my chest and is pulling tight on it. I can't feel my hands." And she just went, "Well, it's your choice to be at work." And she sent an email effectively confirming our conversation. And I don't know, I don't think it's the same, but in the police, if you have a conversation with somebody, particularly a supervisor to the junior ranking officer, we like to put it in emails so that we've got evidential record of our conversations. Very policey, that is, but it's very dehumanising, the fact that she wasn't able to offer any other support than this when it was so critical. And I talk about feeling good and display rules being implied. Well, you can take an awful lot out of this scenario. And then this just treating people as resources. And now I know we're very understaffed and it's very difficult to resource crime scenes at the moment. But we have to think about what implications the way we treat people has on their mental health and their sickness records and the impact that has on the operational force. This quote here is from an officer who has the team, the shift that they've been working, they've been called to a stabbing and they've been the first on the scene. They've been working on a person that's been stabbed, who's actually bled to death and died. They've then been asked to stand on the crime scene. And this is what they say. We'd been doing first aid on the person that got stabbed and we were covered in his blood and we were left on a crime scene for 8 hours. Covered in his blood, no supervisor thought it was a good idea to swap us out. We were watching a guy die and then being left on the crime scene covered in blood. Now, there are so many things within that. The message that says to those officers is, A, we're not worried about your health because there is a biohazard issue about them standing there covered in blood. But also, we don't care about how you feel. We don't care about what you've just experienced. We don't even care if you need the toilet, let's be fair. So there's a lot of within this that says that devalues the police officer, not just their emotions, but their role in relation to and their worth in relation to that scene. What I didn't look at when I was working on my PhD, but I'm actually exploring more now, is moral injury. Now, moral injury is not a mental health, a clinical psychological issue. It is a concept, but it is recognised as contributing factor within PTSD. So moral injury is social, psychological and spiritual harm that arises from a betrayal of one's core values, such as justice, fairness and loyalty. And it comes from harming others, failing to protect others through error or inaction, and failure to be protected by leaders. They all wound a person's conscience, leading to lasting anger, guilt and shame, and can fundamentally alter one's worldview and impair the ability to trust others. Now, again, there's so much within that description of moral injury that can relate to police officers. So justice and fairness, we can see how that is being undermined by the actions of leaders and the organisation. The feeling that they're not able to protect other people is significant, and also that feeling of not being protected by leaders who should be looking after them. And the way I see it is that it erodes people's resilience when they don't feel valued, and they also feel guilt and anger at not being able to help each other, as well as not feeling supported themselves. And just a couple of visual demonstrations of what moral injury can look like. And I had a quote here. This is from my first pilot study, but I recognise it now as moral injury. So this is an officer who's saying They want to protect domestic violence victims, but their sergeant won't listen to them, and they don't believe that what they're suggesting is necessary. And they're scared by that because they want to save this person. They want to protect them, and they're afraid that if they don't, what will be the outcome? And that's significant because that's being not supported. That's themselves not being able to help somebody else, and it's not being supported and protected by their own supervisor, leading to moral injury as well as trauma and PTSD. So leadership is key in moral injury. Emergency workers who are let down by leaders during and after major incidents, so that quote by the SLT, not supporting people after a terrorist act, not being there during a major incident, and being betrayed by people in authority. So there's a lot of scope for moral injury within our emergency services, which brings me on to consequence and trust. So one of my other findings within my PhD was that there were consequences, significant consequences to speaking about emotions and feelings. And those consequences were often career limiting. And this leads to a lack of trust. So police officers do not trust the people around them. They don't trust their supervisors. So there is no one within the organisation that they feel they can open up to, which adds to that emotional labour and adds to that suppression and that requirement to dissociate from their feelings. And this is really contrary to an organisation that is a service, that it talks about an empathetic and compassionate service that works for the public, that cares for victims. And they talk about learning to suppress their emotions. And that if they don't, it's a sign of not coping, and that it's a weakness, which is completely contrary to what the organisation, the service actually asks from them. And that's where the difference between what an organisation is espousing as values and what their culture actually delivers. And as this quote says, the worst thing that you can be told is if you don't like it, to go and do something else. But people that join the police service, and most of our emergency services and our caring and health services, because people care about what they do and they're passionate. And that's what leads me on to my next finding, is the people that spoke in my survey, and the people that were really struggling with the emotional labour, were actually the people that cared the most. They, the type that were doing extra work outside the organisation, were perhaps victim organisations. They sacrificed a lot of themselves. They put their work and other people before themselves. They felt isolated in their work ethic because they felt they had to do more than others around them. They wanted to, but they felt secondary to the organisation, felt secondary to the investigation and to the public, and they felt that was right, and they tried to live up to that. But they also felt very dehumanised by the organisation and the public, and that concept of being a robot. And they felt that the way that the organisation was set up, they didn't have time to deal with their emotions, and they felt isolated in that. And so when we think about response shifts, it's really intense in the response shifts. They don't get time to speak to others. They're single crewed, they're isolated, so they're remote workers going from one traumatic event to another, and they're very good at manipulating and switching between different emotions. So for this example, you could be really, really struggling with a four-handed RTC. There is nothing there, you're just expected to get on with it. You've left the job, told dispatch that you've gone, and you're ready for the next job, and it's right, can you go to this shoplifter detained? It's like yesterday's newspaper, it's gone. It's weird, and these are the type of things that stay with you. And that it's gone, it's weird, it's that surreal effect, that derealization, suppressing things. It doesn't exist anymore. You're dissociating from the reality of what you've just experienced. And police officers are really aware of the contradiction between what they're expected to do and how they're expected to treat victims who witness things, but how they are treated themselves when they witness things. As I say, it's like our brains, being told our brains are physically different. And as we know, the neuroscience now, I work with a lovely neuroscientist called Jess Miller in Cambridge, who, we've actually imaged police officers' brains. And actually it turns out their hippocampus is smaller. That's the part that files on the memories, because they're dealing with an amygdala that's constantly firing. But their brains are completely the same as everybody else's. Their amygdala responds to threat like everybody else's does. And one of the main key things is that police officers don't have relationships where they can talk to people. They no longer have a sense of police family. They don't have time to develop peer relationships and to the point of trust. And that takes time. One officer said you need to spend about 18 months with someone before you really trust that they're not going to judge you and talk about what you've said about your feelings. Supervisors aren't trusted, and they feel they're unempathetic, and I refer back to, again, they're probably quite dissociated themselves. Teams are disparate, but then we move into outside of the organisation. Family members too, as members of the public, they expect police officers to be like that because that's how they understand police officers, to be very stoic and unemotional. And police officers can't live up to that identity, as they want to protect their families from the work that they do, and see them as members of the public. So they're never truly honest to them, because also they fear that they'd worry that they couldn't do the job. And so they say, yeah, you can't be yourself, and it's a lonely place to be. And we know that loneliness leads to depression, and we have really isolated workers here dealing with a lot of trauma. And you're not allowed to speak about how you feel. You can't wear your heart on your sleeve. Again, going back to what is the service that we're trying to deliver. And then who do you trust? Who do you think you can talk to? Because nobody's talking in the organisation. Nobody expresses their emotions. So how are you going to be the first person to do that? And police officers often are asked to deal with deaths in the family because everybody expects them to be better at dealing with that because they're used to it. But by the same time, police officers are also so dissociated that they're not having those emotions. So if you remember the symptomology I showed at the beginning, we're talking about, I know I have emotions, I just don't feel them. It's, close people are dying to, people who are close to them, and they're not having the normal emotional reactions because they're so suppressed. So what does it mean for our staff? What does it mean for the police? Well, the attitude is suck it up. You've got to get on with the job. You just got to go. You've got to keep pushing on to the next job. As this says, you like the walking wounded. You go on, you go to the next job, you go to the next job, and there's no time to process it all. And we end up with very poorly police officers. But these officers that I'm quoting here are on the front line. They're not sick. They are possibly quite ill, but they're not sick away from work. They're in work, operational and working, but they're not sleeping at night. They're not talking about their emotions. They're not communicating socially. They don't go out anymore. They're withdrawing from social engagement because all they talk about is, what's on their mind, which is all the things they see. They're boxing their emotions, which is dissociating their emotions. And they feel desensitized. And I think the last quote is the big problem. And that says the fact that at the moment the organisation thinks dissociated police officers is actually good because on the face value, they're seeing police officers that aren't presenting fear. They're not expressing emotions. So they will go and deal with anything. But the problems we've got is in the long term, give it 10 to 15 years, people are becoming significantly ill with PTSD. Is that on the way to that, people are suffering with anxiety and depression, but also one of the main emotions that we are allowed to express in the police service, you need to stop saying we, is anger. And therefore, we have a real issue with how police officers are allowed to or feel able to communicate with the communities that they serve. And this is where I've become interested and find it very difficult in dealing with, Black Lives Matter, in the fact that only communication skills, is anger. How are we going to have good community relations? But it suits the job for people not to have any emotional expression. And then the officers talk about making yourself numb, and that's just the ultimate dissociative behavior, and that's going to be somebody who, if not already, is going to lead on to having PTSD symptomology. So for me, what I'm looking at now is what we should be doing as an organisation. What should the police service be doing? As I said, I'm really lucky. I'm an associate, I'm an advisor to the College of Policing. So I'm delivering something similar soon to chief officers for their CPD later on in this month. I've been delivering this to superintendents and direct entry inspectors, and I've been touring the country doing a wellbeing for leadership, trying to get my research out to them. But I'm moving to the OU, and I'm getting to design also with the College of Policing interventions that I think will be useful, and education that I think will be useful to help police officers and help address this culture. One of the first things that I'm really aware of, and where I think we need to begin in the police service, is this self-awareness. Before we can get on addressing how we process emotions, how we deal with dissociation, is actually getting people to understand that they have emotions, recognizing that they have emotions, because at the moment people are not emotionally aware. They're very good at manipulating emotions, but they're not very good at identifying, as you could imagine, because they're so suppressed, their own emotions. So I'm interested in emotional intelligence, and emotional intelligence supporting self-awareness, emotional intelligence and leadership, where people are able to be compassionate and empathetic towards their staff and to support them, and for a culture of compassion in how we treat our police officers, because that's ultimately the service we want to deliver to the public. So emotional intelligence obviously begins with self-awareness, and then it moves on to self-management, which is, you could argue, is a lot of what people manage to do. But social awareness as well is picking up and understanding other people's emotional experiences. And this is really important for policing. So emotional intelligence is really core to what we do, but also relationship management, and that empathetic response is really important for emotional intelligence. And we already know from studying business the impact that emotional intelligence can have on success. If we don't get the moral, the ethical argument for changing our approach and for emotional intelligence and educating emotional intelligence to police, certainly we should get the argument for how successful people are when they use emotional intelligence. But also it has the impact it has on relationships, and also the impact it has on people coping with traumatic incidents. And I think that the reduction of turnover of critical care nurses is really important in how actually helping people be emotional intelligence helps them be self-aware. And helps them cope and understand and recognise the emotions they're dealing with, is somewhat the antithesis to emotional labour. And with that, I'm really interested in and advocate self-reflection for emotional well-being. So in November, I held a ESRC social science fair event, and it was looking at emotional well-being in the emergency services across the board, because emotional labour isn't just a police thing, and it's not just an emergency services thing. But I really became aware of what our other partner services, so paramedics, nurses, healthcare, nursing staff, nursing care staff, people caring in the community, healthcare in the community. Because of the pandemic, what we were seeing was an increase in people that were experienced a significant trauma, and by that I mean that they were exposed to threat to their own lives in a way that they probably never have been before, very similar to what the police experience. They're also exposed to an increasing levels of death that they wouldn't normally be exposed to, and also they're an increasing in a lack of self-efficacy, a lack of ability to do anything, particularly in the early days of the pandemic, an inability to solve the issues and prevent the deaths that are happening. We talk about moral injury, we talk about trauma, all of these things really significant. And for me, my work in the police, I was identifying from my research what I'd done in the police, what was happening in our healthcare and emergency services on a broader spectrum. So I held this social science fair event to actually pull all that together and pull the different services together. And one of the things that I am designing is an education model on self-reflection for self-care. And that self-reflection, which we normally look at in ways of personal development, it's a good educational tool, is actually really good for getting people to reflect back on experiences and look at their emotions and try and see where those emotions are coming from. It's really important. It's key in decision making. This quote here from Gilly is that often to events, our first reaction is our emotional reaction. Now, if we're not emotionally aware and we don't realise that we're having an emotional response, we don't know that emotional response is driving us. We also don't know where that emotional response is coming from. Is it something from our past, our childhood, or is it something that happened 2 years ago when we went to a similar event? And it's important that we know this, because our decisions, we like to think that they're all rational, but the truth is that a lot of our decision making is emotional, and we need to understand what impact they're having on those decision making. And suppressing our emotions not only makes us ill, makes us bad at decision making and doesn't allow us to develop. So I'm very keen on self-reflection for all our health and emergency service. and understanding the impact of emotional labour. And the importance about reflective practice is that too often or not, people think that they're reflecting. But what we often find is people are ruminating, reliving events again and again, and emotions that are related to them without able to process and move them on. And actually, when we ruminate, and particularly on a traumatic event, what we're doing is we're igniting our amygdala again. And rather than moving on and calming the amygdala down and still dealing with the events and processing it, what we're doing is making the amygdala fire and fire and fire, and our hippocampus is overwhelmed, and we can't get to that position where we can move on and learn from the events. And this is where I feel that reflective practice, coupled with emotional intelligence, is one of the most powerful tools that we could use within our services that are exposed to so much trauma. So that was a bit of a canter through. I can't even tell how long I've taken. Yeah, a little bit too long, but thanks very much.
Only very slightly. It's a great presentation. Thanks, Ptsd.
It's okay. I'll try and get the slides done.
There you go. Yeah. And I'm going to hand over to Paul.
Thanks, SJ. I think this is really important work, because those of us that have been looking at emotional labour for well over a decade will know that very little has been done about those in frontline traumatic, harmful occupations. And I think this is something that we're all becoming particularly conscious of, particularly during the COVID pandemic. And I think it's very timely. I think it's very important that somebody points out the human cost of this type of work. I mean, what's interesting is, despite all my years of looking at this, I've only just come across a health and safety executive report, which I'm just putting in the chat box, from 2008, which is an extensive 150-page report on the harm of emotionally intense jobs. Right. And I haven't looked at it in great detail. And when I say I've only just come across it, I mean in the last week or so. I think it's interesting. They don't even look at the impact of brutal trauma. That's all the experiences that you've been conveying to us, and the stories that we hear nightly on the news of what's going on in hospitals, whether it's nursing staff, mortuary staff, ICU staff, paramedics. Joseph sat here, his sister's a paramedic. I've got kids who are in the emergency frontline services, and so often there's no place for these people to talk about what happens, no time to process, no support. And I think one of the points that we are particularly interested in, I think, as scholars of work and employment, is the impact austerity has had on exacerbating this. I mean, I know Greater Manchester Police moved to single crewed first responders immediately. It was virtually their first reaction to austerity back in 2009, 2010, where individual police officers attend potentially very dangerous situations on their own with only a body cam as protection in many ways. And likewise, we've heard increasing stories about what happens to paramedics as well, and firefighters being put in increasingly dangerous situations. So I'd be really interested to hear, your own reflections on the impact of austerity, understaffing, etc. And I'm sure a lot of the people here will have experiences from their own family and friends and contacts of what that similar types of impact as well. I suppose to sort of draw it down to a more sort of academic level of analysis. I mean, in my conversations with you and thinking about this, what you might call this form of extreme work, I don't know if you're aware of the extreme work and risk work literature there is in sociology in particular. I mean, I know your area is more occupational psychology, so I wouldn't necessarily expect you to. But one of the things that we think about here and draw on Arlie Hochschild's work is her notion of the toe and the heel. We think about emotional labour, we think about the slightly fluffy side of customer service, of being nice, being entertaining, being performative in some fashion, or in its most routine and banal way, sort of flipping burgers and serving burgers, you know. But the reality of emotional labour for most people is one, or in the public service, of being open often to abuse, if not to traumatic situations, and that can be people working, for example, in job centres, you know, people working in the welfare benefit system. It can also be, obviously, all the emergency services, but simply just being on the end of a phone can be abusive. And I think one of the most telling pieces of research, I think that will ever come out really of all this sort of turns to service work debate, is I think a relatively simple piece of research by Marek Korzinski in 2003 on communities of coping. He simply recorded how when, this is in a call centre, how when one person got abused, the whole effect on that person echoed culturally through the whole team. People stopped and shared. There was an immediate collective attempt to try and help because it has ramifications. And of course, what we do know now increasingly, that exactly what Harley Hochschild was saying, that emotional labour in all its forms is alienating, right? Because it is not natural to hide your true feelings, to have unequal relationships, because they are all unequal relationships when you're being paid to do this. And at the end of the day, when you're at your Christmas do with your family, you do have the option of saying, God, you're awful, I never want to see you again, if you need to. This isn't an option for people in work where you are paid to do it and you are a product. And I think what's interesting, and I really recommend people read SJ's paper, is she does highlight how police servicing does both the toe and the heel. So it does both the enforcing, the grimacing, the controlling, the ultimate physical threat underneath the uniform, in the sense of we can arrest you and take you away, yeah, but also having to be compassionate and pleasant, the customer service side of the job at the same time. And I think this makes it a double bind in many ways. The harm becomes double, and at one level I'm not surprised that you get this collapse of mental health in many ways into this depersonalisation, dissociation. So I'm going to sort of say, I mean, I think that the Marek Korzinski's work on communities of coping, I suppose one of the things you didn't have time to talk about was how policing amongst them, police officers among themselves manage it. What's their culture of solidarity like?
But that's the problem.
And yeah, I'm sure there is. Yeah, and also, are there any sort of initiation rituals? I mean, Jason Hughes, Ruth Simpson's work on butchers' apprentices is full of stories of brutal ritualization processes, so that apprentices can actually sort of get used to blood, gore, and death every minute of the day, if you like. So that's one thing. I suppose the other thing is, to what extent does because policing, like the fire service as well, has a command and control system. It doesn't have a normal managerial system where, you know, 360-degree feedback is not something on offer, not that it is in most workplaces, but, you know, the idea of having an engaged conversation, it doesn't necessarily fit easily into a command and control environment, you know, where you are ranks, you know. And my final question really is, to what extent is policing sustainable, or indeed as it's currently? Because I mean, I know from my own personal knowledge that levels of sickness are so high in the police force, and it's also similar in other frontline occupations, but particularly so, that many officers, particularly in force response, don't last much beyond 50.
No.
So what happens? What next? Is it just about individual coping strategy, or does there have to be a serious reinvestment in the number of jobs, the quality of jobs, so that the working environment is safer in terms of resourcing. So I'll leave it there anyway.
Okay, you might have to remind me of some of those questions. So I'll answer the last one first. In terms of what's the sustainability of the police? Is the police fit for service? I'd say that no, it's not fit for service, and it's not sustainable in its current shape or form. And that has been recognised by the College of Policing, and it has been recognised for a while now. Not just, well, probably not at all because of the sickness, but because actually the changing in society, the significant changes to crime, social technologies, the polarisation of communities, all of this is having a massive impact. And our traditional ways of policing, and more important for me, the traditional police identity doesn't fit what police officers are being asked to do at the moment. So part of my research, the original part of my PhD looked at how identity is created in the media and how the public identity of the police officer is created and how that is projected onto the police officer. And we're still subjected to the idea that police officers are crime fighting, they're running about and arresting people, and it's all very good fun and exciting, and also that they're all burnt out and ill. And 80% of the public only ever have no contact with the police. The only understanding they have with the police is through that media identity, and that needs to change because it doesn't fit what police are doing. It doesn't fit the toe in the heel, as you quite rightly point out, and that is a significant issue because police officers need to be compassionate, expected to be compassionate, and to have a community response to policing, and have done for some time, but now more so they're dealing with mental health issues than anything else. And the outcomes of mental health, but aren't equipped to deal with it because they try to arrest their way out of it because they're not educated in, and the police officer identity and role and services and set up are equipped to deal with that. So there is an issue, but it's different. It's being addressed differently than the sickness levels. Communities of coping, and this is part of the problem, and communities of coping and initiation all in one. Many moons ago, when my parents were police officers, there were communities of coping in terms of there used to be police bars and canteens. The coping used to be the maladaptive coping of drinking. Police officers would get together and talk about war stories. Now, I'm not saying actually that they were very good at processing any better than they are now. The symptomology of police officers and ill PTSD police officers was actually drink driving, domestic violence, etc. And didn't live much beyond their retirement age. In fact, I think it was 5 years was the average length of pension for a police officer. So they had different outcomes. But that was their community of coping. It was together. And they talked in a fashion about things. And they had initiations. And those initiations were, in fact, I can still remember some of them. Classic, so for the time of CS gas, and this is probably still being recorded, people used to get tied to chairs and gas to see if they could cope with it. People used to get sent to murder scenes and told horrible stories, then the team would jump all over them and scare them in the middle of the night, silly things like that. Dealing with fear, violence. There used to be, in my day, an awful lot of aggression, as in within the walls of a police station, police officers were often found thumping each other because they were just very angry because they had no outlet whatsoever. What police officers now say is community of coping is there is none. So they feel that their sense of team and the family of policing has been eroded completely. We don't have training schools anymore, so we don't meet anywhere collectively. We don't, because of the loss of police infrastructure, physical infrastructure, we don't have canteens, we don't have bars. There's nowhere for people to meet. Society has changed, families have changed. Police officers aren't going to the pub with each other after work anymore. They're going home to their families, which is, in one way it's lovely, but they're not talking to their families. So they're very isolated in that sense. And that has significantly impacted them. And they feel very much, because of the hostility towards emotional expression, the stigma towards mental health, their fear of the political correctness around black humour has caused a lot of problems, they feel, although my research shows that black humour is actually isolating for those people that want to speak openly about their emotions. All has removed, there is no community of coping, and I think that's the nub of the issue here, is it is that community of coping that could alleviate a lot of the PTSD mental health outcomes, because the psychology behind it is quite simple about having those conversations. So that is what I would like to see addressed through what I'm talking about, is trying to get people to talk to each other, trying to challenge the stigma around emotions through using emotional intelligence. You talked about hierarchical supervisory
Command and
control. And this is one of the arguments that I'm going to put forward to the CPD for the chief officers at the end of the month, is that command and control has its place in the police, because we deal with riots, we deal with life and death situations. At times you have to, and I'm ex-army, so I have a sympathy, you have to be able to say to people, go in there and fight, and they can't question you. It has to happen. But for that to be realistic, you have to treat people decently when you're not in that situation. And this is where police management, police leaders need to learn to be different leaders for different situations. We need an emotionally intelligent leader that can adapt depending on circumstances. We need people that can be servant leaders, that can be authentic leaders, that can be transformational leaders, as well as being command and control gold leaders whenever it's required. And I think that's lacking in police leadership education. And it's something that I want to put forward. And in my work at the AU, I'm hoping we can address too. Austerity. So I was in the police when austerity came in, and they talk about feeling and display rules and how they are implied and learnt. You talked about Greater Manchester Police and the single crewing policy. So single crewing, not having a canteen, all part of austerity, actually not having any pens anymore. So you have to go and buy your shift pens from Asda, having no coffee. In the police station I last served at, they didn't even have a water thing. You didn't have a cold water fountain, whatever they're called. These send signals to police officers that they're not worthy, that they are not valued, and if their physical needs are not met by literally having water or somewhere to eat or have a coffee or something to write with, they won't feel that their emotions or their mental health is worthy of speaking up or valued within the organisation. So austerity has sent a very strong message, and it comes from the government, and it is being perpetuated by the media's response to seeing people having coffee outside in society, that they are worth less than the average member of the public. The single crewing policy was challenged by GMP Federation. It's a piece of research by Jonathan Hounsmouth, who it's identified that police officers at single crewed are more likely to be assaulted and are more likely to be abused. It makes sense. But what we all also know is they're also more likely to struggle with their mental health and well-being. So GMP rescinded their policy in single crewing. But it doesn't matter what your policy says. If you are saying to your sergeants, resource every call that's coming in through the door, and you've only got half the resources that you used to have, and double the amount of crime that's coming in through the door, what option does that sergeant have other than to single crew people and send them out anyway? So it's all right talking about policies, but actually it's meaningfully understanding that you put the well-being and the safety of the officers before they deal with the crime. Because there's an old saying, the old, if there's if you're in an aircraft and the masks come down, you put your own on first before you put somebody else's on, because if you're dead, you can't help anybody else. Police cars used to be a ticker tape. Used to say it's about driving slowly. It's better to get there late than never at all. And that was about educating people about responding on blue lights. It is better that we have more police officers that are healthy, that are able to deliver a service and to resource crime, rather than single crewing them and inevitably making the increase in mental health illness and sickness that we have currently in the police. Did I answer everything?
Great.
Okay.
Thanks. It was a comprehensive answer to a very comprehensive set of questions. So I'll take questions from the audience now. So Anne-Marie first.
Thank you so much. That was so just interesting and full, and it sparks off so many things to me. I have 3 things to say, if that's all right. The first is, I'm sure that you have come across it, but obviously this has such resonance with me with work by Jenna Ward and Rob McMurray, and obviously Jenna, formerly of this parish, Phil, who I work with closely on the emotional challenges of managing volunteers. But Jenna and Rob have done work on what they call emotional dirty work, and have written a book and then a number of articles. But I just really, the resonance, and they have actually looked at frontline police officers, but in addition, funeral directors, Samaritan suicide counsellors, and a number of other kind of at that frontline, really difficult emotional work. So I'm sure that's something. I was also, you just really made me think about that worthiness. I had just at the last bit that you just said, because I'm involved in a project at the moment. This sounds really tangential, but isn't. A women's theatre company that works with women, called Clean Break, that works with women at risk of the criminal justice system or who have been in prison. And I was just suddenly thinking about if the police officers themselves, and what I mean is you're always hearing about abuse or the way in which these people are not treated well by the police, if you see what I mean. Yeah. But if police officers themselves aren't made to feel worthy, how is that going to be then translated into how they react in occasions when they're, out there?
Yeah.
The third thing is, so then I was wondering, so what do we do then? So, and I was thinking here, can you teach this? Can the performative work be taught? And this is something that Jenna and I have been dealing with in terms of putting together a toolkit for managers in the National Trust in terms of how they might manage emotionally the challenges that are nothing like what you're talking about with police officers, but still cause immense amounts of mental health issues and difficulties at work. Can you do that for the police force?
Yeah, well, the police force is the challenge, isn't it? But can you as a human being? And what we're working on is, I don't know if you heard of the compassionate work toolkit. If not, go and have a look. Fiona Meakin wrote it at Manchester University. She's currently the lead for Strategic Command course at the College of Policing, and she leads on compassionate leadership and compassionate work. The one thing about compassion, if we begin there at a very good starting point for how to address these issues we're talking about, compassion is natural to all us. Toddlers show compassion to one another. It's an innate human response to somebody in distress. We unlearn it through our life and social learning. So you can teach compassion. You can teach compassion through self-compassion, because once people become self-aware and self-compassionate, they learn to empathise with others. And it's possible. And this is our sort of it's very difficult for the police because there's so much stigma around the word compassion. Literally, senior leaders say we're not using the word compassion, because that's how bad and entrenched that culture is. But that's why I say emotional intelligence, because it's more palatable. But what I'm talking about is learning to be a self-aware, being self-compassionate. Because once you've re-engaged with your own compassion, your own emotions, your own emotional experience, and recognise that in others, it's very difficult not to be compassionate and empathetic towards others. And that is the basis for where we go. Then we bleed that into leadership, decision-making, policy-making, get it spread out and understand how our individual decisions and actions spread out to the rest of the organisation. But yeah, for me, compassion, self-compassion, compassionate leadership, compassionate work is the answer. But it's a dirty word.
Thanks. Joseph.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. And I suppose I want to develop a couple of the questions that Paul raised towards the end of what he was saying, because there's obviously an element of what you're doing which is very generalizable. I mean, Paul mentioned my sister's a paramedic. I often think back to the accounts of the firefighters at Grenfell, and there was a very, very good piece on the radio talking about them going into this burning building and the kind of impact. And I can see how what you're saying generalizes to those groups, but I want to probe you a little bit more about the specific role of the police, because there are structural determinations here in society that shape policing in a way that to me make it much less amenable to the kind of things you're suggesting. And it's an obvious question, but I wanted to ask you more about it, because if you think about the police, unlike the paramedics or the firefighters, this is a key sort of disciplinary apparatus of the state.
Yeah.
And if you read the sort of historical and sociological literature, which I'm sure you're familiar with, about how that's impacted on how police officers have lived, and you know this from your own experience, but historically police officers living outside of their own communities, going to the same bars. I remember there was a
Yeah.
bar in East London where the police went,
Yeah.
and if you were a social movement activist like me, you didn't go to that bar. And there was this kind of sense in which the police are shaped in this very hierarchical way, because this is the nature of the social institution that they represent, and therefore you have to have this very tight chain of command. And in that sense, to me, it's not so much like the paramedics or the firefighters, but it reflects some of the things you hear about in army training centres and in the barracks and so on, of these very disciplinary organisations that are engaged in hazing, brutalisation, and so on. And you sort of touched on it because you mentioned a couple of times that the emotionless Robocop is seen as suited to this function. But it seems to me that there is something, there is a reality to that as well, if you're being asked to fulfill this kind of societal role. And of course, there's a dark side to it as well, in terms of the kind of the history of sort of silence around certain issues, and the history of corruption, the police force, and so on, which you also acknowledge, and the bullying that goes along with that, and so on. So, yeah, I suppose I'm asking you really, how typical are the police of this kind of array of difficult frontline jobs? And to what extent do those kind of structural societal considerations feed into what you're arguing?
So I think you're right. There is a uniqueness to the police role because of that. They are actors of the state and they enforce the law. And there is that disciplinary, it's not just the disciplinary aspect to it, but it's their ability to take somebody's liberty. I think Paul talked about, you know, on one hand, you might be at a scene and you're going to arrest somebody, but at the same time trying to show compassion to a victim. And there's, you know, that's complexity. But like I said, I was so interested in how this identity, because it's so strong, how these rules are created. I looked initially outside of the organisation because I don't believe that they are wholly, or if at all, constructed within the organisation. They're just perpetuated. And it is society that's creating the identity. It's perpetuated even more so by the media, and in more different ways that are even less at the control of the police service. But I do think that is an issue. There is a need, you're right, there is a need for people to deal with difficult things and to act as disciplinary and to enforce the law. That is actually such a small element of policing these days, and that is kind of like a hangover of the history of the police. They started off as just law enforcers, as brutalizers almost. They were the city watch. And that sort of, you know, you could only join the police if you're a male, if you're over a certain height. The fitness test was, you know, robust. You had to be able to physically fight. That is not the police services today. There is an element, as we know, as I acknowledge, and there is a need for that. But it's so small in comparison to the changed service that we have now and the changed society that we have now. And I've always advocated that, and more so now, that the police use media to construct the identity that's needed of their police officers and not let it be the other way around. Because there's a good chance that going forward, the policing that we're looking at, yeah, there might be more violence because we've got polarised society, but is it going to be constructed online? How much more communication with our communities are we going to need to do because of that? At the moment, violent crime has dropped so far because our lack of access to alcohol. People aren't going to pubs and having fights anymore, which used to be a massive source of violence and violent crime. Not really answering. Probably I don't have the answer for you because it is so difficult. What I advocate is the recognition that there needs to be more than one way to police. And there needs to be more than one way to lead. And that if people are going out and doing these difficult things, that doesn't perpetuate back into the police station. It's not somewhere where people are brutalised within the police station as well as outside the police station. But I think we need to take control of that identity, you know, and we don't have control of the identity. As long as the public see us as that, then we're going to struggle.
Thanks. Irina, and then if anyone else wants to intervene, please raise your hand.
Thanks, Phil, and thank you, Sarah Jane. What a fantastic talk. I really, really enjoyed it, and your Your data is just incredible.
Thank you.
The evidence you have got is absolutely fantastic. I think you could do something really quite exciting writing this up. I've got a couple of comments. The first one's very practical. It does strike me that the model the police service should perhaps use, and it's one they may resist, is that used by counsellors, because counsellors are very accustomed to dealing with emotionally traumatic things, and therefore it is a requirement, if you are a counsellor, that you yourself have a counsellor to whom you can talk about emotionally traumatic things, because it's taken as read that this is going to come up as part of your work, and some sort of model like that I think is desperately needed.
If I could reflect that back to you, I completely agree. I've also done a little research on emotional labour in academia, and I argue the same thing.
Yes.
Because we perform a similar function. But anyway, that's just an aside. But yes, I do agree. But I do think the social conversation is a way forward towards that processing.
Yes, I agree. I think Paul's comment about Marek Putzinski's communities of coping is spot on. The one area of concern I would have is your use of the emotional intelligence literature. And I can see why you do that, because it's such an attractive term, and it seems to describe exactly what you need. And it's the sort of thing that is going to have lots of buy-in from practitioners, but it really is not a particularly resilient literature. And I don't think it can cope with the theoretical weight that, if I were you, I would want to put on it. So I think for academic purposes, you would be a lot better off either developing emotional labour in the direction you want it to go, or coming up with your own variant.
Right. Okay.
I wouldn't try to use the emotional intelligence literature personally.
Okay.
Because I think you will end up having to distort your data to fit it, and your data is worth way more than that literature. So it's a comment rather than a question.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you, appreciate that.
That's a great comment. Bob.
Again, thank you, Sarah, for the presentation. Which I think was rich, and it beautifully described the responses of officers to what are very difficult circumstances. But I suppose I want to pose something which is a little gentler than perhaps the way in which Joseph posed it, but it again goes to the underlying reasons why a police organisation should find itself in this position, which amounts to it being organisationally dysfunctional. And if it was just a question of ignorance, although I'm sure that many aspects of your research are novel, if it was just a matter of ignorance, I think would be an immediate and positive response to your research, and you would find very easily that that the recommendations started to be enshrined. And I doubt very much that that's going to be the case. And so the question really underlying it is, why is an organisation like this? And it's not to say all of your responses will be met negatively, but a number of them, and a number of your emphases are actually individual ones, which you say will build up individual resilience through emotional intelligence and compassionate work, but the experience of other organisations trying to bring about cultural change is very disappointing. And you can go across the range from the NHS dealing with the experience of black and ethnic minority workers, despite having really good leadership at a particular time, the impact has been relatively small. But the research that they did around that, or Roger Klein did around and published work saying that there really is only one way, and that is actually for corporate leadership to adopt very clear policies and to put in them in such a way that they become compulsory for the organization to be able to display all the way down to the bottom that they take them seriously, and that they can show they're being implemented, as opposed to showing that they've discussed and got education programs, which everybody knows are really just so much window dressing for a culture that continues unchanged beneath it. So in a sense, I'm talking. It refers back to structure. And the way in which you change structure, or the inability or the weakness of trying to change structure through what amounts to individual cultural change.
Yes, I agree with all those points. It is difficult. So the first issue is hierarchy and the way that we promote within the police, and the fact that we promote in our own like, and therefore everybody learns from the person above them who's completely socially, emotionally suppressed, and it perpetuates from that point, and that is our initial problem. The government's already tried to address that for other reasons, but other cultural reasons, by direct entry, bringing people in sideways who have not come up through the ranks, and that is one angle. The point about education at the moment, and the way that I'm working with the College of Policing at the top, is the beginning of what I agree with you on the point that we need to make it policy. We need, because people are making policies that are undermined by the culture, the single crewing policy being exactly that, is that people at the top really need to know education first, and then need to how to enact that out in behaviours and policy and changes within the organisation. That needs to be enforced, and I'm lucky that the people that I've now got who are working the College of Policing are behind this, and we're working together, is the Health and Safety Executive report, but the Health and Safety Executive, the HSE requirements. And I do think that the police service is actually very vulnerable at the moment for being challenged legally on how they are treating police officers. They fall very short of protecting them psychologically. So making people accountable in that sense, I think, is important. And I'm surprised we have not had a court case brought yet, a class A. The other side of cultural change, and this is all optimism, is critical mass. We have 20,000 police officers joining us. It's called the Police Uplift. You've probably heard about it. It's been promised by the government. They are coming, and I'm involved directly within their education with other people who believe what changes need to be made in terms of the things we've been talking about. So we hope for a critical mass, and we also hope for the fact that that critical number of people come from a different generation that have a different attitude. That said, you're right. The approaches that I'm taking are individual, and it's asking people to challenge the culture, which is always very difficult. I'm not sure I make an apology for that, because that's what police officers are meant to do. They are meant to stand up for what is right and be individual leaders. So I would hope that they can take on board what we're saying. But I agree with you. I mean, we've had these conversations with the group of people that I work with within policing, that, this has been conversation for years, and we haven't managed. We have wellbeing initiatives, we have mental health, we have the window dressing. It has happened. Nothing has changed. We're on a dreadful state. So how are we going to make a difference? We're not just here to educate. We're here to be a bit more brutal, if I'm honest with you, with our senior leaders, because we have the ability to do that. We're now in the positions where we have that. We have the evidence background. Many different approaches. I don't know. We're trying our best. We are very passionate about making a difference, as everybody is. But, you know, watch this space, you never know.
That's absolutely great, thanks. We have, I think, 4 minutes left of our scheduled meeting time, so if anyone wants to come back very quickly, they may. Otherwise, I'd just like to congratulate you, SJ, on a really fantastic piece of research, and I agree with you, Raina. The access to data that you have there is really fantastic, and certainly very interesting things could be done with it academically. What can be done in regards to some of the inertial forces that you're working against is a different question, I guess. Yeah. But you'd be better informed than I would on your process and research. But it certainly is a fantastic piece of research.
Thank you.
So I believe, Paul, there's the next seminar's on the 10th of March. I have down Sabi Shibata.
On the gig economy in
Japan, yeah.
And Phoebe Moore will be discussing there, and obviously we know about Phoebe's work as well on artificial intelligence. Also, we got a late addition to the webinar program. David Coates, you may or may not have seen, has had a major new report out on basically what needs to happen to ensure a fairer economy and fairer outcomes, meeting the challenges of technology, climate change and COVID, particularly in the so-called left behind towns and manufacturing sectors in this country. Now, David Coates is a visiting professor with CSWEF. This story was picked up by the Mirror, so I'll be sending out information on this once I've fixed the date with David, hoping to get this webinar set up sooner rather than later, because the university is about to put publicity out as well. So it might be as soon as 2 weeks from now, but I'd have to have a chat with the work and employment leadership so we can move a meeting if that's the case, or possibly sometime in March. So early warning of that, and I think that will be something really interesting to get our teeth into, particularly in the current very uncertain times and future that we're facing economically around work and employment. Okay, I'd like to say big thanks, SJ. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Thank you.
And don't forget to contact, I'll get in touch with you about Jason.
Thank you. Please do, yes.
And feel free to stay. I'm going to switch the recording off now. So if you want to stay for a chat afterwards, please join.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.